This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then notes on resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month.
These are people's lives. We shouldn't be making money off of people being sick. Like CEOs shouldn't be thriving financially when the rest of us are on the ground working, just trying to get by. Our medical assistants are making pennies, and they're the ones keeping all of our outpatient clinics together.
Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. My guest today is Tara Rynders. She's a nurse and a dancer and the CEO and founder of The Clinic, which combines arts, music, and movement and caring science for healthcare professionals. We talked about resiliency as a softening, and then Tara has a great word instead of resilience, brilliance, which I love. I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Thanks for joining us. And if you're liking Notes on Resilience, find us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe and leave a review. We would love that. I also am looking for feedback from my listeners. I have a form. There's a link in the show notes. Want you to give me some feedback. What are you liking about the show? What aren't you liking? What do you wish we were doing more of? We're busy planning for 2024, and I want to know what you guys want to hear. Thanks so much. Hi, Tara. I am so excited to have you on the podcast today. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
And before we get into finding out who you are and what you do, I would love to know if you could have any superpower in the world, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good question. I as a child, I've always loved the idea of flying. So if I could fly, and yet really the word superpower for me is a little tricky because as a healthcare provider, we've been called superheroes for so long. And so I have thought through this like superheroes, superpowers. And I think at the end of the day, I would love to fly. And I also recognize my humanity as my superhero, my superpower, my ability to cry and share my emotions and be human as one of the most significant superpowers that we actually already have.
Oh, that is so true. Thank you for sharing that. And you're right. I'm glad you said that because it is easy to want to elevate and want to look at people as heroes, and either we're all heroes or none of us are heroes. I feel like I can't figure out what the definition is anymore.
Yeah. But I love that idea of flying too.
Yes.
Something we cannot do right now.
Yes. Oh, I imagine the freedom, how that would feel. So thank you for sharing that. And now we'll dig into, who are you and what do you do? And how are you and I in a place today to be talking about resiliency?
Yeah, my name is Tara Rynders, and I am a nurse. I've been a nurse for over 20 years, 25. I was a CNA, a nursing assistant before that. So spent a long time in healthcare and being with patients. And I'm also a dancer. I have my master's in dance. And the work that I do is called The Clinic. And we bring together healthcare providers and the arts and movement and play and dance to create spaces of humanity and spaces of spaces that we can recognize the resilient and brilliant humans we already are, to reflect that back to one another.
Oh, wow. I love the concept of movement and sort of that creativity in supporting resilience.
Yeah.
How did you get started in that side of your world?
I grew up dancing. And so when things happen, I think as a child, things happen to us that can feel and are very traumatic. And we all have different journeys with that. And so when things happen to me, I turned to dance as a way to release. And I didn't have the language for it or didn't really understand, but just knew I felt better when I would go to a dance class or I would move my body, or go play outside and put on a performance for the neighborhood, whatever it may be. It always brought me a lot of joy. And at the time, I think a lot of healing. And so I continued to dance my whole life as an outlet, as something that I loved. And even while I was getting my nursing degree, and it was after my mother passed away in 2006 that I couldn't bounce back.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel resilient, and I was nursing full time. And I decided to go per diem as a nurse and go back to school full time to get my master's in dance and run to what I knew to be a place where I could hopefully find my joy again.
Wow, that's so great. I know that I have appreciated the power of movement when I was to help me get through things. And sometimes dancing, sometimes walking, sometimes just moving for the sake of moving, whatever it might look like to somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think about the word resilience?
So it's funny because during COVID, everyone, when I was working as a nurse during COVID, everyone kept saying, like, you have to be more resilient, whatever you need to do just to be more resilient. And I remember thinking, I think nurses are some of the most resilient people I know. And so it felt like this thing that is onus that kept being put back on me as the individual. And so I really grew to dislike this word resilience. And I created my own word, and I called it rebrilliancy. And what that means to me is when we speak of resilience, I actually think we're speaking of rebrilliancy. It's finding spaces that reflect back the brilliant and resilient humans we already are. Because I really believe that we're born resilient. That's in all of us. And what we're looking for are systems and spaces that can reflect that back and help pull out our strengths. So it's really like an appreciative inquiry type of theory as well, focusing on our strengths. And it's been my experience that rebrilliancy really, when we're seen as brilliant, when we're seen as resilient already, we step into those places within us. So,
yes. It really resonates with me. You're thinking of the role of our systems and institutions in supporting this part of ourselves. And what kind of role do you think our systems and institutions, however you want to define that, have in helping people heal from trauma and in helping people be resilient?
That's an interesting twist on the question. I love that because I feel like mostly I'm thinking about the ways that the lack, like where can we go better? But going back to that, like appreciative look at it, I love thinking of it in the ways that our systems have shown up. And I think about the different spaces that I've been in the hospital spaces that have created peer support systems where you have access 24 hours a day to call a peer responder to share what it is, whatever it may be that you're feeling or needing in the moment. I think that has been really important. I think of a group called Debriefing the Front Lines, who've created spaces to debrief like big incidents that happen, to not just, go over it like nothing, I feel like we should still be debriefing what has happened during COVID. And yet our hospital systems have continued just to move forward. So I think that debriefing, that taking that pause, that moment to reflect has been really powerful in the spaces that have adopted that program. And then I know, the work that I do and have been doing with healthcare providers and been doing a lot with Kaiser Permanente on bringing the arts and play and movement and creating spaces for nurses to embody and somatically process their grief has also been really important and impactful.
Wow. So there's some really powerful ways that institutions are supporting resiliency, especially in the healthcare and the nursing field, it sounds like. So your job as a nurse sounds like it can be quite difficult. I talk to a lot of first responders and emergency managers who talk about the trauma of doing the work that they do and dealing with other people who are going through difficult times. So I'm curious how you manage that. I mean, I'm not sure. I know that nurses do many different roles, but I feel like some nurses certainly are exposed to the trauma of the individual who they're helping. And I'm just wondering how that impacts you.
Yeah, I can say my time when I was working as an ER nurse for many, many years, it was really difficult because we didn't have the language and there wasn't this conversation around our mental wellness being important and that it was actually a thing. And so I remember many times having this secondary trauma from my patients and it also becoming a primary trauma for me. So like, for example, I remember a patient who came in. I remember wheeling her back and she was bleeding because she was having I believe she ended up having a miscarriage. And I just remember like the stream of blood as I pushed her back and thinking, oh God. And I remember bringing her in and she just started like howling. She said, please save my baby. Please save my baby. And I remember just like grabbing her and putting her head to my chest, saying, we're going to do everything we can. And her just like this battle cry almost for like anything, like as a mom, like anything you can do to like preserve this child within. And I think it was 1 or 2 days later, I didn't even know I was pregnant and I had my own miscarriage. And I thought back to my patient and I remember thanking her because I so appreciated her raw grief, her rawness. And I remember doing my own battle cry. And so there's this really interesting thing that happens. There's secondary trauma for sure that happened there. I felt her trauma. I brought it home. And, I also had my own trauma that many times has aligned with my patients.
Right.
And so we're holding the secondary and we're holding this primary trauma as well. So, after my mother passed away from cancer, I had all these other patients who were passing away from cancer. And so it's always this weird interweaving and aligning with the grief and the trauma. And then I remember coming home and swallowing my tears because I didn't know how to process it. There wasn't a space to do that. And so, yeah. And I think now the ways that I do process trauma, and I no longer work in the ER, but I'm able to, I have the language. So I release it through movement, through journaling, whatever it may be. I remind people that I need help, that I'm human and that I need care. And then I rest. I try to find spaces of like radical rest, which I used to always think it was like running or biking. But no, it's just sitting without an agenda for me. It's just like going outside and letting the world come to me instead of rushing to the world, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. I like that concept of radical rest. And thank you for sharing that story. Now, you talked about in the past that we didn't necessarily have the language to talk about mental health struggles. You personally might not have necessarily had the tools or known what to do, but how do you feel like as a society, as institutions, we're moving forward? Do you think that we do have the language now? Do you think people are listening now?
I think we're making huge strides. I think that the fact that this podcast exists is an example of something beautiful, right? Spaces for people to share stories like I shared and be held in that and feel safe enough to do that. And I think, unfortunately, when I look at how our systems are built, specifically in healthcare, they're really built on capitalism and racism and white supremacy and all of these things that need to be dismantled. And part of that is, looking at the bottom line. And I see hospitals starting to understand that nurses are leaving, turnover is happening, they're losing money. So now that it's something they're able to see, I think they're starting to make some changes, but not because of the hearts of their providers, not because of what is happening to us. I think in many times we get taken advantage of.
Yeah.
For being ones who want to help and want to care for others. So I think there are strides for sure. We're talking about it. There's more language around it. There's more theories. There's more research. And yet I still think we have a long way to go, especially for those who are on the ground.
Yeah.
As far as caring for them, we have a long way to go to figure out how to properly care for those who are caring.
Right. What do you think are 1 or 2 steps that we should be taking now to move further in that direction of taking care of the carers?
Yeah, I think, some of the bottom line, like basics of equitable pay, staffing ratios are things that we've been fighting for a long time in healthcare. And I think wellness and care for the caregivers needs to be embedded in all that we do all day long. So there's a code. After a code, we know we always go to debrief. That just happens. It's embedded in the system. So it's creating those system changes alongside patient, ratios, how many patients we have based on acuity and different things that we now know. We now have the data for what's safe and what's not safe. Are there programs when somebody's feeling like I need a minute? Can I be transferred to this other department? So I'm not doing this really intense traumatic work day in and day out. And we know that causes burnout. So now that we know that, then we create a rotation program where then they go work in pediatrics or do something like, or not, pediatrics is just as traumatic, but maybe in labor and delivery, or can there be some cross training that happens that allow us to have breaks? But I really think it's a fundamental belief system that needs to shift, along with this idea of like focusing on strengths, because providers and systems are always looking for what's wrong. In the ER, you come in, what's wrong with you? What's worst case scenario? And so it's that mentality instead of like, oh, what's working? What are your strengths? How can I support you? Professional development is huge. Having one-on-ones with our leaders really caring about us and figuring out who we are as individuals and what we need to thrive in these situations. So those are some thoughts and ideas. And again, this embedded care. What if the workshops I did or the debriefing, what if that's all embedded? And so it's not something else they have to do.
Right.
It's like, every third Friday, you go to this 8-hour play workshop where you just get to play without purpose and you just get to be as a human. And that how healing is that.
Right. That would be amazing. What do you think are some of the biggest barriers to making these changes on a wide scale?
I think one of the barriers I would have to say is, I could say for myself that I may be one of the barriers, that maybe the healthcare workers in some cases, we're willing to continue to give and give and give. And so part of the work that I love is helping empower us to have boundaries and to say, this isn't okay. The system's not set up for me to thrive. So I'm not going to take part of it. There's others. So I think setting those strong boundaries, and in so many ways, I feel like we get taken advantage of, if we work at like safety net hospitals, we're there for a reason. Because we care for these populations, and then we don't get paid as much for whatever it may be. Right. And then I think that it's the leaders, it's our CEOs, they need to get paid way less. There just needs to be equitable pay. Like they have the money. It's shifting the money. It's shifting priorities. And so I think it all comes down to capitalism and wanting to make the most money, most bang for their buck. And these are people's lives. We shouldn't be making money off of people being sick. Like CEOs shouldn't be thriving financially when the rest of us are on the ground working, just trying to get by. Our medical assistants are making pennies, and they're the ones keeping all of our outpatient clinics together.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. And from your mouth to the ears of the universe and the system to make some of these changes. I appreciate you opening up about that. And, kind of to the thing that we're talking about is resiliency, whether we're talking about systems or individuals. And what do you think people most misunderstand about resiliency?
I think it's actually resiliency softening. And I think that's maybe the misconception I had growing up, was that I needed to bounce back harder and faster and stronger. And I think what we actually as a society and as systems and as individuals need to do is soften. And on the work that I've created, and as a nurse researcher and facilitator and movement facilitator and workshops that we give, we created the courageous care framework. And I think it really, for me, is the new definition of resiliency. And it's first to soften. And once we soften, we can receive. When I was a patient for the first time, and I almost died from an ectopic pregnancy. So I've had multiple miscarriages, and this was an ectopic pregnancy I was having. And I remember being completely passed out because I was bleeding internally. And they were, taking me to emergency surgery, and I was in Trendelenburg with my feet in the air. And I remember my nurse comes to me and grabs my hand, and she whispers, "I'm here and you're going to be okay." And she's holding my hand. And I remember I could hear everything. And I had this knee-jerk reaction of like wanting to pull away from her. I almost felt embarrassed. Like, I'm okay. Like I got this. Like, don't care for me right now. Okay. And then in a moment, I was like, I had 6-month-old twins at home. I was like, Tara, you could be dying right now. Like, this could be it. And you're like, not going to let her care for you. And so I went through all of this in my brain in these like 5 seconds, and I ended up softening and like letting her hold my hand. And then I was able to receive. So I think there's this resiliency that's not hardening, it's softening. And then we can receive, and we do it in community. We do it with one another together.
Yes.
And I think that's what brings the healing and then ultimately the joy.
Yes, absolutely. I like that concept of resiliency as a softening, because I do think we often in this society talk about things in a way like you're getting harder, you're getting stronger, you're fighting back. We talk in, I think, very hard terms about what this all means. But I think as individuals, and your story illustrates, it's really about letting go and being vulnerable and maybe not pushing so hard.
And maybe even doing less, right? Like there's always this idea to do more, but what if who we are, like at our core, is like actually it's tearing away all the masks and the hard shells, and it's actually less work to be resilient at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we're getting close to the end of our time, but what's one question that you wish I had asked you, and how would you have answered it?
It's just something that I've been thinking of, and that I'm just curious about is how guilt interplays with resiliency, and how just we think as a woman and a mother and a caregiver. I've just been personally interested in the guilt that I hold of not being enough, and also like a professional, not being enough for my kids, for my work, for all these things, and who's putting that on me. So I'm curious about what the role it plays in being resilient, like those who are able to not feel guilty in their lives, if that's
are there any people like that?
Why do we feel so guilty? Why is it, religious upbringing? What is it? So I'm curious about those intersections, because I haven't heard much around that.
Right. I'm glad you asked that question, and whether or not we can answer it. But I think about, in my experience, I had survivor's guilt. I felt guilty that I survived when other people didn't. And that, as a form of guilt, that's pretty challenging. And where does that come from? And that's something natural that, I've heard a lot of people experience. So now I'm very curious about guilt and the concept of it and why it is so prevalent.
How did you see that impacting your resiliency if you want to share?
Well, I can say how it reflected my recovery, which is that early on, I didn't think I needed help, or I didn't think I deserved to get help because I walked away. I had no physical injuries. And I had people say to me, I don't believe with the purpose of making me feel guilty for having survived, things like, well, you still have both your legs, so you should be very happy you're alive. And yes, I am. So for me, it was something I really had to work through, fight against, stop believing the things in my head that were telling me I should feel bad for surviving. And instead, why don't we just feel excited and happy that we're alive and didn't suffer? In my case, I will say that one of the frustrations was that there wasn't a lot of public support or conversation about those of us who walked away from the bombing with mental health wounds. And early on, I found myself wishing I had been physically injured so that people would pay attention to what happened to me and they would count what happened to me as real.
Yeah.
So all of that was swirling around in my mind as I was dealing with all this. And I suppose eventually the fact of all of that helped me realize how important it was to look out for myself.
Mm.
And though I didn't call it resiliency at the time, but to tap into the things that I needed to tap into.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. Thank you for sharing. And it makes me see the parallel between, as nurses, we're surrounded by people who are sick, right? And we're always like, well, at least I'm not losing a child like this mother is, or at least I'm not having to go to surgery to fix my colitis or whatever it may be.
Right.
So there's also why, I have it. They're way, there's a lot more going on there than with me. And so I haven't made that correlation either, but I think that that's part of it. And it makes it difficult to receive when there's that guilt. Like I'm not deserving. I think there's worthiness in it and identity as a nurse as being the one who's always caring.
Yes.
And then also shame. Like I hear what you're saying too, of I can imagine too, like I have my legs and all these things people tell you, right, that are so hard to hear and very not helpful.
Yes.
Like produce shame too around you. Yeah, around it all. And the wounds that we carry being visible versus invisible.
Yeah.
Wounds. And yeah.
It's a complicated thing being a human. I think sometimes we get lulled into things are going well for a while and we get lulled into thinking maybe things are okay. And we've all got a lot going on. Anyway, I could go down that path, but let's not. And, we're getting close to the end. And one question I like to ask everybody is, what would you tell your 18-year-old self about resiliency?
I feel like my 18-year-old self was so resilient. Like I look back at her and so I would probably say, dear little Tara, like, yes, just like know that, hold on to your truth. Because I see how in so many cases my truth was taken in order to please or in order to, I don't know, prove myself, whatever it may be. But I just think as little children, we know, and I think I held onto it for a long time, this inner knowing of what we truly need. And then everyone else starts telling you what you need or what you should need or who you should be. And so I just want to offer that to her now that she had everything she needed.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And how can our listeners reach you?
They could reach out. I have a website, theclinicperformance.com, and they could email. You can reach out on the website. So the website's perfect, theclinicperformance.com.
Excellent. I'll put a link to that in the show notes to make it easier for folks to get in touch with you. And Tara, thank you so much for sharing your story and talking about resiliency and rebrilliancy and all of these great topics. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your story too.
Oh, thanks. All right, to our listeners, thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinsky, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.